Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Norma Nieto, and I'll be facilitating our cloud adoption strategies and optimized roadmap for application migration and leveraging your cloud today. We want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded, and the download link to the recording will be shared with you afterward. Second, we will have live Q&A at the end with our presenters. To ask a question, please use the question feature on your GoToWebinar control panel, usually found at the right side of your screen. You can use the question feature during the presentation as well if questions arise as you're watching. For any questions we can't get to in our live session today, we'll follow up with you afterwards. Now, I'd like to quickly introduce our presenters. We have Mike Snell, our VP of Solutions Delivery here at CEI. He has over 25 years of experience leading our teams to create software that clients love. He has led our CEI Solutions Group for the last 18 years. He's a recognized thought leader and is also a published author of the Visual Studio Unleashed series of books. And he has worked across multiple successful delivery of projects in nearly every industry using almost every technology out there that you can think of. Our main presenter today is Geoff Tewksbury. He's our principal architect here at CEI. He is a cloud thought leader and Azure thought leader, as well as being responsible for leading a lot of our onshore and offshore teams in large complex engagements that leverage technologies like Microsoft Azure, SharePoint, Windows 8, and mobile solutions. Geoff has over 16 years experience in cloud specifically with software development, architecture, and design. He is a Microsoft certified applications developer and a Microsoft partner technology solutions professional. Also joining us today will be our Cloud Alliance leaders here from CEI, Brett Cocking, Todd Kaduk, and Sandy Marich. They will introduce themselves a little bit later after the main presentation and talk a little bit about our capabilities across each of the clouds. We'll be covering these topics today. Just quick, we'll talk a little bit about why a cloud adoption strategy is important, and then Geoff will present on our cloud adoption framework. We'll talk a little bit about our cloud capabilities and how we can help, and we'll wrap up with Q&A. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Mike Snell to kick us off.
Excellent, thanks, Norman. Go ahead. All right, so we want to start just talking about some of the stats and facts and challenges that companies are facing when they think about their cloud adoption strategy and how they're moving and leveraging the cloud. So taking a look at this slide here, let's talk about some of the cloud stats and facts that are driving that wider, broader cloud adoption and that strong need for the governance framework. You can see that nearly all enterprises are embracing cloud. Many have a multi-cloud strategy. No longer are folks wondering about, should I go to the cloud or what cloud do I go to? Now it's about controlling, governing, and optimizing for the cloud, making sure that you're getting the most out of your spend, you're innovating, and you're controlling and governing what you build out there in the cloud. This includes getting control of that cloud spend. You can see that it's estimated that organizations waste approximately 30% of their cloud spend. Obviously, we want to make cost control a big part of any adoption strategy. Other trends include moving from the typical VMs and IaaS to a platform as a service, help customers take advantage of innovations with the cloud services, with scale, with cost control, things like that. And of course, that last bit of stats and facts, you can see that cloud platforms have really evolved to three key players: AWS, Microsoft, and Google. And as Norman pointed out, we're going to talk about each today. They each have an adoption framework, which we're going to talk about, but you'll see that they're all very similar in size and scope, and it's all about leveraging those frameworks to define your strategy moving to the cloud. So go ahead, Norman. So some of the challenges, most organizations face a number of challenges when moving or adopting the cloud, and they're starting to wonder, how do we get our arms around some of these challenges? The challenges, of course, require a defined strategy and approach to ensure teams are following best practices and they're getting the most out of their innovation dollar, if you will. That's really critical, right? Because the cloud is an opportunity to innovate and to provide more. And as you spend that money, you want to make sure that you're overcoming some of these challenges. So challenges around things like enabling rapid innovation without creating silos, defining standards, but still enabling agility for the team. Of course, cloud skills are also very important. You want to make sure that you've enabled a team to work within the cloud without requiring each team member to be an expert, right? And so that, a lot of the expert level cloud stuff can be done for that team and leveraged by the team. And of course, managing and tracking spend, as we mentioned, is important. We want to be able to do that across application, across division, and not just the myriad of many cloud services that are out there. We're going to look at how a cloud adoption strategy and framework will help you overcome many of these challenges. Go ahead, Norma. And so lastly, we want to talk about how do you start, right? So like most things, we recommend starting with an overall cloud adoption strategy. The cloud platform, it's a powerful tool that enables teams to really rethink their existing workloads and increase their scale. However, this power can be daunting, misused, and often expensive if not adopted in the following a standard framework. So a good strategy is going to bring together people, process, technology, and enable teams to work within defined standards, establish governance and cost controls and monitoring. I think there's a few more. Yeah, there you go. And I think there's one more. There you go. So aligning these key elements will help make sure that you meet your customers' expectations and your core business goals while remaining efficient, secure, and agile. So next, I'll hand it off to Geoff. He's going to walk us through key components of a cloud adoption framework. There's definitely a defined framework for all three clouds we'll discuss. However, you'll see each one of these, AWS, Google, Microsoft, they're all very similar in scope and process. All yours, Geoff.
All right, thanks, Mike. So I could talk to you guys today about a little more detail around what are cloud adoption frameworks, what often referred to as CAF, C-A-F. So when we look at cloud adoption frameworks, they kind of have two main level concerns that Mike kind of touched upon. One is from a planning aspect. How do organizations approach a strategic, structured way to plan out their cloud adoption? There will be short-term goals, there will be more long-term goals. But how do you go from an on-premise kind of environment to more of a cloud-native organization over time? And as we'll see, those approaches that kind of help to dictate those migrations are often incremental. So there's that planning aspect to it, but the other side of it is also that operational maturity, taking a look at the governance as well as the enablement of that platform for teams. So oftentimes when we think about cloud platforms that are going to be delivered to the organization, we really see it as a platform that is being delivered to the IT organization. So you'll have development teams that need to build software to support their initiatives. You'll have different business units that have software to support their initiatives. And really, when we talk about that operational maturity, we're talking about delivering that back to the organization as a platform that they can use. It touches governance, security, compliance, DevOps, and like I mentioned, enablement. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So Norma, if you could go to the next slide, we're not going to spend a ton of time on each of these, but like Mike said, each public cloud provider, AWS, Google, Azure, they all have their own kind of variation of a cloud adoption framework, but they all do kind of center on the same fundamentals, which is the solutions, the people, and the processes, right? So we can see here from the AWS perspective, you can see a lot of those are highlighted as well. If you go to the next slide, Norma, when we look at the GCP side, very similar in nature in that we're worried more about that kind of those overlapping circles there. You can see that we're worried again about the people, the technologies, and the processes that are used to manage your cloud platforms. So this is kind of Google's version of this. And then if you go to the next slide, Norma, we have Microsoft's version of this for Azure. I'm going to spend the most part of today, just because it would be quite a bit to kind of go through each of these individually in a 20-minute time span, but we're going to spend most of our time looking at this from the Azure lens. But it's just important to note that many of these topics bleed across all these different providers. And really what we're talking about here when we talk about any CAF is that if you went back 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of organizations were on their own in order to kind of wade these waters and figure out, well, how do we plan for our migration? How are we going to govern this environment? What's the best practices to do so? And all these, AWS, GCP, and Azure, all these cloud providers have kind of learned and garnered the best practices that they've seen over countless implementations in their environments in terms of how to approach this from a strategic perspective. So just be aware that what we talk about today, although focused on the lens of the Azure migration and cloud adoption frameworks, are kind of attributable to all. So if we look here at the high level, you can see that we're broken into a few phases. Just going across and talking about these kind of holistically, we have our strategy phase, which is really important. This is going to center us in terms of our planning efforts and in regards to how we are going to look at our short and long-term roadmaps for what's important to us as an organization in order to migrate to the cloud. We then go through a planning effort, which is really starting to make sure that we have a cloud adoption plan. And as we'll talk about the cloud adoption plan, that is very much a backlog. Just like agile teams working through software development, that is very much a backlog of the effort that we believe in a prioritized fashion that we want to work through in order to make ourselves a cloud native or at least have less of a footprint on-prem and move more towards a cloud native environment. We then have our readiness phase. So we want to make sure that when we migrate to the cloud, that we have everything thought through and stood up that's going to support our environments. There's a lot of kind of cross-cutting concerns and foundational elements that we want to have in play in any of these environments: monitoring, governance, guardrails or policies, compliance that needs to be addressed. We want to make sure that all those things are there and readily available so that people that are going to build onto that platform can have comfort and stability in what they're going to be deploying. So that's kind of that readiness phase. And then obviously we have the adoption, where we're actually going ahead and actually starting to migrate workloads out there. Underpinning all of this is the thought process toward governance, enablement, and management. And we'll talk about that. So if we go to the next slide, Norma, we'll start digging into this a little bit. First, we'll talk about the motivation. So during our kind of strategy section here, we really want to be thinking about what are our primary motivations for wanting to digitally transform ourselves into the cloud. Because you need that motivation to center yourself to make sure you're making an effective kind of targeted plan for how you're going to migrate. These typically fall under a couple of primary categories. Two are listed here: migration, innovation. So migration is typically scenarios such as we're looking to get cost savings. We're looking to not have to manage hardware and incur those costs anymore. We want to optimize our internal operations. Maybe it's taking us too long to procure resources or get resources in-house to be able to stand up certain workloads, maybe like big data workloads and things like that. We want to reduce vendor complexity. Maybe we have a lot of vendor solutions that are deployed on-prem that require complex integrations and things of that nature, and we want to move to more of a SaaS-based model so we can move away from having to care and feed for those solutions. On the flip side of that, you have more innovation type solutions. That's where you want to really transform your operations. You want to enable your teams to work much more effectively than previously possible. Maybe there's market disruptions that you guys are looking at in terms of new products and services based on data and AI. Or maybe you just want to empower your internal operations and have more self-service environments. Maybe you're looking to have new ways that teams can collaborate. Those would all kind of fall into that innovations bucket. A third bucket that we do see also are just critical business events. So things like mergers and acquisitions, necessary reductions in capital expenses, things of that nature. responses to regulatory compliance changes. So these are all very high level buckets in terms of motivations, these migrations versus innovation. And it's important for us to kind of identify where do we fall along this spectrum. And you're probably going to find yourself saying, well, we have things in each of these buckets that we want to address. But where you're really looking for at the very beginning of your journey are the trends. Are you trending more towards migration kind of scenarios, or are you trending more towards innovation scenarios? Because based on those trends, there are kind of different paths that you would take through your planning efforts and your readiness efforts. So if we go to the next slide, Norma. So the next thing we want to do is we want to center ourselves on business outcomes. So we understand the motivations now, and we've maybe made some decisions on, you know what, we're more on a migration path or more on an innovation path. Now we want to understand what are the business outcomes that we want to achieve through these migrations. And so really what we're talking about here is defining qualitative and quantitative results that align with those motivations that we addressed up front. And there's a number of pieces of information that really help when we're trying to define this. So number one, we want to understand who our stakeholders are in the organization. Right? So we want to be able to figure out who's going to get the most value from this proposition of transforming ourselves to a cloud-first environment. And we also want to know who's going to help us champion these environments, because as we know, a cloud journey is going to be a long-term strategic investment. We need to make sure that we've got buy-in from the right people if we want to, have a chance of succeeding. We all want to understand the business drivers. So what are the current challenges that we plan on addressing based on these migration or innovation scenarios? And then what are the actual business outcomes that we're trying to achieve? Some examples might be we're looking to save on costs through some fiscal outcomes, or maybe we're looking to increase team agility, or maybe we're just looking to reach new customers. Based on those business outcomes, that's going to really help us to drive our path moving forward as well. We then want to be able to make some quantitative kind of analysis and be able to actually define what are some KPIs that we can measure ourselves against, right? How can we actually make sure that these business outcomes that we've defined, that we're actually living up to what we anticipated those benefits would be? And then lastly, we want to get a good understanding of what are the capabilities that we're looking to migrate over these timeframes, and what are the solutions that will be involved in achieving those outcomes and those desired business objectives. So if you go to the next slide, Norma. So now we start talking about actually planning for an actual workload to migrate. And it's important to note that really any productive transformation, whether or not it's cloud transformation, just in general digital transformation, really successful ones, during successful implementations of these, the planning has to grow in parallel with adoption, right? What we want to do is we want to fight the urge to overanalyze everything before we do anything. We want to make sure that we're actually constructing as we're planning. And there's a number of reasons for this. And that's to this end where we really recommend, as part of the overall strategy effort, select kind of a first project that you think would be a good catalyst for your cloud adoption. Typically something small, something low risk if you don't have a lot of exposure to a cloud environment to date. And use that for a number of scenarios. Number one, that'll help you get kind of a growth mindset. It'll encourage learning and exploration, which is going to be vital. And it gives the team an opportunity to develop the necessary skills in order to start to get understanding of what is this new world going to look like. It creates situations that encourage new ways of collaborating. As you go through and you start thinking about, a cloud adoption strategy, you're going to start to understand, wow, we need to get people from the development team, we need people from finance, we probably need to collaborate with people from the networking team, people from the DevOps teams, people from the different business units. And you'll start to notice that there's patterns of communication that can fall through in order to help you kind of achieve some of your goals and really plan this thing out thoroughly. Also, by picking a first project and working through it as you plan out your grander migration, you start to identify gaps in areas where you can partner maybe with others in the organization, or even with the individuals outside the organization, they could be assistants. And it also, and probably one of the more important things, is it provides tangible inputs to your adoption plan. So everything looks good on paper, but obviously we all know that things change, and we need to be able to make sure that we actually have working examples of things to make sure that we're going down the right path before we go too far. So that's why we really recommend selecting that first project during that strategy phase and using it to kind of get kind of as a, kind of as a stepping stone in terms of making sure that your plan adoption makes sense and is going to work for you. So if we go to the next slide, now that's kind of the strategy portion, right? So we're level setting ourselves, we're understanding what the business motivations and outcomes are, and we're starting to plan around a first project so that we can use that as a catalyst for the remainder of our cloud adoption. Now, the next step is kind of a grander planning that we want to do. So if you go to the next slide, we'll kind of dive into this a little bit. So one of the first things here is organizational alignment, and this is really at the heart of looking at this from an operational model. There's a typical balance that we need to strike when we're talking about really development and governance, right? So when we look at any kind of MVP or minimal viable product for a cloud migration, there are really two primary teams that you're going to need. And you may find yourselves as you grow, these teams may expand and they may kind of branch off into more targeted teams. But at a minimum, you need two. You're going to need a cloud adoption team and a cloud governance team. So a cloud governance team, those are the individuals who are going to stand up this platform and make it available to the organization. These individuals are very concerned about security, compliance, governance. They want to make sure this does not turn into the wild, wild west. The cloud adoption team, they're more worried about speed. They're more worried about, these are the development teams, rather the DevOps teams who are being pushed to develop new features and deliver those out to the organization. They're more focused on wanting to be able to deliver things quickly, effectively, without any roadblocks. And so these two teams need to work together because they both have very important roles, but those roles are oftentimes in conflict with each other. So we have to kind of work together to make sure that both teams are getting what they need out of the environment. If you go to the next slide. So once we've kind of established those core teams that can start to talk through some of these things, we then need to kind of think through what is our current digital estate. And they have something called the 5 R's. It's rehost, refactor, rebuild, re-architect, and retire. They've kind of broken it down or collapsed it into 3 here: rehost, refactor, and retire. But the idea here is that there are probably different scenarios for different workloads that you might want to move. So you may have some workloads that you just think you might want to rehost, and that's typically what we consider like a lift and shift. These may be things like wanting to migrate applications hosted on VMs so as to reduce data center footprints or potential capital expenses, things of that nature. Then you have more the rebuild or re-architect, which fall into this refactor category, where maybe you want to get more use out of the native cloud as opposed to just taking VMs and putting them into a cloud environment, right? You want to start to leverage platform services. You want to start to embrace all the things that you can get from cloud that are built in on your behalf. These are the refactor scenarios where you kind of take a solution and you do some level of refactoring or re-architecting depending on how well it could match into a cloud architecture, so you can start to take advantage of some of those benefits. And then lastly, you have retire. You might have some things on-prem that you're using today that you find that when you start to move to maybe a refactor scenario or even a rehost scenario, that you don't need anymore. Like as an example, with app services, if you're going to be hosting web applications, they have built-in load balancers in order to support kind of dynamic scale up and scale down. So if you have load balancing, internal load balancing platforms in-house that you're using today to achieve that, you might not need that anymore. So you want to take a look at your digital estate, which, by the way, when we say digital estate, we're really talking about all your VMs, your servers, your applications, your data, and your platforms that are managed by your IT organization, and kind of start to look at them in terms of what are some high priorities that you would have for migrating these to the cloud, and what would these look like if you were to migrate? Would they be hosting scenarios? Would they be refactoring scenarios, or are they simply going to be retired and are no longer needed? Next, Norma, if we look at the next slide. So this is kind of just talking about the fact that, yeah, there are going to be a lot of new technology, skills, concepts, things of that nature that your team is going to have to absorb. And you also want to make sure that you have individuals who understand their responsibility in managing this cloud environment. So that's where RACIs come in. That's where training and things of that come in. We've talked to organizations who have gone as far as to not only have, training that's delivered through AWS or through Microsoft for their vendor-specific certifications, but we've talked with customers that have gone far enough to say, we give training in terms of how to use our cloud environment. So any kind of governance specific to our environment, any kind of standards or things like that that we put in place, that they have training specific to that, which builds off the vendor training. So it is important to take a look at this because you're going to have networking engineers, systems engineers, developers, QA, operations. All these individuals are going to have to kind of have the appropriate knowledge in order to kind of carry this forward. So if you go to the next slide, Norma. Lastly, the cloud adoption plan. This is kind of the output of the planning effort. This is very much a backlog for your cloud adoption roadmap. They do recommend oftentimes not trying to get everything in here. There's a notion of a power of 5 or 10, which is kind of take that top 5 or 10 strategic workloads that you think would make the most sense and get those back into that backlog so that you can start to work down through it. And treat it like you would treat any other kind of agile project where you're going to walk through that backlog. You're going to look at prioritizing these things. You're going to look at dependencies. So kind of how do you need to order this in terms of making sure you get dependencies in before the things that are dependent on them, things of that nature. If you go to the next slide, Norma. So now we need to make sure that we're in our we're ready for these migrations. And this is a big topic that we're going to cover very, very briefly here. But if you go into the next slide, what we really want to do is we want to make sure that we're setting up our environment to provide success in terms of that governance and enablement that we want to support. Now, this slide is very focused on kind of Azure in terms of the types of resources it's showing here, but there's a couple things that you want to think about. So you want to think about what is your account structure going to look like, right? So in the Azure world, we're talking about management groups and subscriptions and how you organize that. And oftentimes when we do is we want to look at the types of solutions and environments that you maintain. So do you have highly regulated environments that require HIPAA or FedRAMP or PCI compliance? Do you have internal line of business solutions? Maybe you have public internet facing solutions. Maybe you have dev test subscription or dev test solutions outside of prod. You have corporate networking. Those all have different policies, different probably people who manage those solutions, different kind of controls and guardrails that you'd want to put in place to make sure that you're meeting with either your own internal compliance or regulatory compliance. So in the Azure world, it's typically where we look at management groups where we can split those things up so we have those buckets in play. We also have different policies that we want to put in at that regard or guardrails in the AWS world. So maybe you want to require all public-facing websites to be on TLS 1.2, or maybe you want to disable all management ports from EC2s or VMs or things of that nature. These are the policies that you can put in place, and it provides kind of this hierarchical model where when you're at the top level management group level, and you apply those policies, they're inherited by all policies, by all management groups and subscriptions below. So what that allows you to do is have a structure where at the very top organizational level, you have very general policies that apply to your internal organization. But as you have these different types of solutions, some which are more highly regulated, some which are internal versus external, you can carve out these different sections of your cloud environment and have more granular policies and permissions as you work your way down. And then finally, we need to think about landing zones. And really landing zones, next slide, Norma, please, I'm sorry. And when we talk about landing zones, we're really talking about making sure that we have that structure in place. We want to make sure that all the dependencies that we have in order to kind of support our cloud adoption team starting to bring workloads into our cloud environments, we want to make sure that all that stuff's in place. We can think of this as plumbing. Now, how are we going to handle centralized monitoring? How are we going to handle governance and putting guardrails in place so that people can only deploy what we believe they should deploy? How are we going to manage security across the entire environment? How are we going to be able to identify security concerns across all the environments and potential vulnerabilities? How are we going to manage compliance and deployment of environments that will be able to adhere to compliance? How are we going to manage identity and role-based access controls and IAM and things of that nature? So we want to make sure that all that stuff is in place, that we actually have a structured area where people can just start bringing their solutions without having to worry about everything that surrounds them from a management perspective. If you go to the next slide, Norma. And so finally, we're going to actually migrate these solutions over here. And then that goes into, those two different workload types. Either you have a migration strategy where you're looking at your individual assets and probably using something like Azure Migrate to migrate those things across, or maybe you have more of an innovation strategy where you're bringing a development team or a product team in to define a new service or a new capability that you're building in-house and deploying into your environment. And then as we've kind of talked about, next slide is just the governance and the management of this kind of underpins everything. That it's important to be thinking about this all the way from strategy through adoption to make sure that you're being forethoughtful in terms of not only how you're going to govern this, but how you're going to make sure that it's done in such a way that you're not negatively impacting the teams that are going to adopt the platform. And finally, this is kind of a model that we have here at CEI, which tries to articulate this governance model and this enablement model that I've been kind of like, I guess, stressing over the last 20 minutes or so. So if you look at the bottom, we have what we would refer to as the cloud enablement team. Sometimes we refer to them as cloud platform teams. And they're really responsible for building up this platform that's going to be served back to the organization. So they're helping to establish these landing zones. They're helping to establish the networking patterns that we need to put in place. They're building things like blueprints and CloudFormation templates and Terraform templates and things like that to help with teams in order to give them a kickstart in terms of deployments and automation into those environments. We take a look at actually setting up how are we going to actually deploy out these different policies or guardrails or things of that nature, which are going to impact the environment to the extent that we can govern it without having to have everything manually approved by someone before we put them in. And you can see here, we then have the cloud adoption teams, which are kind of coming on top of this platform that's been built by the cloud adoption or the cloud enablement team, and they're starting to put their workloads on top. You know, one of the things we like to do, by the way, is we see a lot of areas where people have very flat, either AWS account structures or Azure subscription structures, and we really recommend taking a look at that and actually breaking those apart a little bit. In the Azure world here, we're seeing that, you know, we're actually taking a look at creating a subscription for each DevOps team. Because what we want to do is we want to be able to hand the keys of that subscription over to a DevOps team so that they can self-manage, they can bring in their own people, and they can manage permissions at their subscription level without having to worry about that going through a central control. There's a lot to talk about and unpack here, and unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to do it. But obviously, if you guys have follow-up questions or things like that, we'd be happy to dive into this more. With that, I want to kick it over to Brett, so Brett can kind of walk us through a little bit more about kind of this level on the AWS side. So thank you very much, and Brett, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Geoff. I appreciate that. So a little background about myself. I joined CI about 7 months ago. Prior to that, I started and ran AWS's global IoT sales team out of Seattle. Obviously, CI's got capabilities that we've been discussing around cloud migrations, but we also have a lot of deep level expertise around IoT based on a lot of the resources in my background as well. One of the things I want to call out, and very proud of the fact that CI has been engaged with the COVID distribution on the rural Northwest and using those cold chain IoT capabilities in that regard. But a little bit more about our capabilities. We're an AWS advanced partner trending towards Premier. And we've got about 30 certified engineers, both across North America, India, and then we're also building out capabilities as well near shore in Peru. So very, very good team. Love the fact that we're based in Pittsburgh and looking forward to working with most of you, or hopefully many of you in the near future on your AWS initiatives. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Yeah, this is Sandy. Thanks, Brett. I just want to do a little same kind of introduction of myself and our relationship with Microsoft. I also have responsibilities for tool sets that complement our cloud directions. I'm the VP of Strategic Alliances, specifically focused on Microsoft. A little background on our capabilities. We're a gold certified partner since 2004 and a managed partner since 2013. I think what's key here is 16 years as a gold partner in Azure, in DevOps, data and cognitive services, and of course, our bread and butter is around application modernization. We have advanced specialization in this area, and only about 10% of the Microsoft partners have this capability. So the combination of cloud and application modernization is a differential for the CEI team. And from your perspective, our team has all the right certifications, right? We have over 80 plus certs. We've provided 100 speaking engagements on cloud-related subjects, and we have authors among the team, like the illustrious Mike Snell, our Senior VP of Delivery. The knowledge base and the ability to deliver is here with CEI. So that's it from the Microsoft side. I'll give it over to Todd. Todd?
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Appreciate you taking the time to join us today. My name is Todd Kaduk. I'm the VP for our Google business unit. I've only been with CEI for a little over a month, but prior to CEI, I spent almost a decade at Google consulting with enterprises on the power of Google's solutions and capabilities, and I'm excited about the growth of our GCP practice here at CEI. You might have seen earlier on one of the slides that Google Cloud is the fastest growing cloud right now, and Google continues to roll out more opportunities for enterprises to leverage the same solutions which Google is not only building, but they've been running on themselves for virtually their entire lifetime. We are a certified Google Cloud partner, have a number of certifications, and are working towards our premier partner status. One of the strengths of Google Cloud is its push towards more of an open source platform and making a number of their solutions like containerization, data consolidation, ML/AI capabilities available in a multi-cloud environment. And our architects and delivery team are well versed in multi-cloud environments and how to deploy hybrid models. And I think that's definitely an advantage that a number of you would want to take advantage of. Not necessarily putting all of your eggs in one basket and taking advantage of the strengths that each of the cloud providers have to offer. The one other area that I'll quickly call out is a shift towards a data-driven mindset. I believe every company at its core should be a data company, and it's something I'd ask all of you to think about. How are you removing data silos? How are you leveraging your data to drive business outcomes? And are you getting the most out of that data from a profitability standpoint? The data that's going to be created in the next 3 years is going to be greater than the last 30 years. And we've got a talented group who can help with not only the collection and transformation of that data, but one of the biggest, most challenging steps, which is how do you actually activate on that data and activate on the insights that are derived from that data. So that's definitely something we can help with, and a multi-cloud environment is something we could bring to the table. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sandy.
Hey, great insight, Todd. Love it. Talking a little bit about how we could help you. We have our next steps. As you can see here, we have a 5-day cloud adoption assessment. So what does that mean? First, on day one, what are the business outcomes you want to go toward? What do you and your business unit or your enterprise want to achieve from a goal perspective? Is it speed to market? Maybe. Is it flexibility and application development? We'll talk about that, and Geoff did. Is it new venture development? So, and then day two, we take the current state of where you are in the cloud journey and what maturity level are you on? And what's the possible priority workloads that you want to focus on? And then day three, we do a workshop on your possible initiatives. We discuss the implementation and the ROI, right? And the cost associated with that. Day four, we document the findings. We solidify the roadmap. We create the cloud adoption strategy. And then day five, we agree, create, and walk through the roadmap. So that's our 5-day assessment. It can be changed to fit your environment. I think that's key here. And it's a quick start that we can definitely address your needs. Now let's talk a little bit about a use case. We have a current customer that went through a similar transition. They're a large manufacturer in the Midwest. And as you can see here, a little bit about their background, objectives, solution, and outcomes. From a background perspective, the manufacturer had several clouds. They wanted to develop applications and teams, as Geoff would say, to support the current customer products, but also build an environment that will make the company competitive in the market. So how do you stay competitive? How do you preserve what you have, but build into different ventures? And how do you do that from a cloud perspective? We also, from an objective perspective, the answer or objective is to build standards or really guardrails for development and security of applications moving forward. You need to do that. From a solution perspective, in partnership with our team, the company developed a cloud adoption framework that leverages Azure, DevOps, SecOps, and basically creates a flexible, governed environment that will enable to build applications in a secure manner. The outcome was an Azure cloud environment that is scalable, secure governance for all adoption teams. And we're seeing this across the industry. It's not just development in IT, but it's development within the engineering group, within a business organization, or operations. The guardrails are in place to build for success. Next slide, please. So our team's ready to help, right? And just a couple thoughts from my perspective is you have to be clear on your goals, as many people have said, have a plan and work the plan. What are the business drivers? What's the return on investment that you want to have from your business perspective or the enterprise? Be sure IT's bought into this and within the business can support the cloud adoption framework. Do you have a champion? This Midwest company has a champion, but we also are helping them assist and support on the journey. Whatever status you're in with the cloud maturity model, we can assist you. Maybe you're in the early phase of cloud adoption, and we see this across the industry, and your desire is not just to lift and shift, but have key workloads or applications that need to be developed to impact markets, your client base, and new ventures. Or you might be a mature cloud enabler that you want to be able to develop applications, or you're developing applications in the cloud. You're already lifting and shifting, but you really want to know from a cost model perspective where you're going and have some predictive capabilities in that area. We can assist, the CEI team can. So we can assist you in the enterprise no matter what industry, what vertical you're in, to be able to build a framework for freedom of development, enable you to then go speed the market with solutions for your clients and new markets, and above all, create a cloud adoption framework with governance and security built for now and your future. I'll give it back to Norma. Norma?
Great, thank you so much, Sandy. We do have a couple minutes left for Q&A if anyone has a specific question. I don't see any yet, but while we're waiting, I just want to thank everybody for their time and remind you that after this, the conclusion of this webinar later today, we'll be downloading the recording links, and you should get those out to you tomorrow. We'll also include a PDF of the presentation itself for those of you who attended today. So at this time, I don't see any questions. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, thank you so much to all our presenters, Mike, Geoff, Sandy, Brett, and Todd. And when you're ready to get started on your cloud journey, please reach out to any one of them, to Brett, Sandy, or Todd, or to your favorite CEI account executive. With that, we'll say good afternoon, thank you, and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.